Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we get started, we wanted to share some brief housekeeping items. You will be joining the event muted. If you have any questions, please share them through the Q&A panel. We will collect and answer them from there. The chat has been disabled for this event. If you are experiencing any audio issues, please make sure you are connected to the computer audio. If you are joining by phone, the number is on the chat panel. And now, LISC's President, Lisa Glover.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for what really promises to be an incredibly timely and very interesting conversation. I am Lisa Glover. I'm the CEO of LISC, and I'm very excited to open up this webinar and introduce this incredible group of speakers. So starting us off, Julia Gordon, the president of the National Community Stabilization Trust, is going to moderate the panel, but also brings very deep expertise in affordable homeownership and has worked tirelessly to ensure that wealth stays within communities. During the foreclosure crisis, LISC recognized it was critical to both preserve affordable housing stock and create opportunities for home ownership. We then came together with other institutions to form NCST in order to help families stay in their homes and also match neighborhood purchasers with properties that could be rehabbed for home ownership. So welcome to Julia.
Thank you.
Next, Andre Perry is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. Andre joins us to discuss his research surrounding staggering racial wealth gaps and what tools and systems need to be put in place to address these inequities. Andre's recent scholarship at Brookings has analyzed Black majority cities and institutions in America, focusing on assets worthy of increasing investment. So welcome to Andre. Next, Denise Scott is the Executive Vice President of Programs at LISC. Denise will share the work that LISC has championed around home ownership and the launch of Project 10X program. With 3 decades of experience in community development, Denise leads LISC's neighborhood investment efforts in 37 cities and is responsible for providing vision and setting strategic direction for our local offices. Denise will highlight the effects that LISC's work has had on the ground in cities like Detroit and how we can replicate those incredible results across the country. And last, Pedro Cohen, who is the Executive Director of LISC Jacksonville. Pedro will provide an up-close analysis of the work happening in Jacksonville, including how we address silent barriers to wealth creation and dismantle them in order to effect systemic change and promote family wealth creation. Pedro's research is largely centered on the social well-being of low socioeconomic communities, and particularly the role that the African American church plays within that space. So welcome, and without further ado, I'll turn the program over to our moderator, Julia Gordon. Thank you for leading us in this discussion today, Julia.
Well, thank you for having me, Lisa, and for the generous introduction. I'm delighted to be on this panel of folks who are making a real difference in the conversation in Washington right now, as well as out in the States, concerning support for families and communities at this time. I will take the opportunity to talk for a minute or two about my own organization, the National Community Stabilization Trust. We work to support families and communities by restoring distressed homes for sustainable, affordable homeownership and responsible rental. Some of you may have heard of our flagship program, which is called REO Match, although many of you know it as the First Look program. And this program supports community development organizations, other nonprofit housing organizations, and mission-focused developers who buy and rehab low-value foreclosed homes and put them back to use either as affordable homeownership or affordable and responsible rental. And what we do is we list properties. These are 1 to 4 unit properties on our web-based platform, where our community partners get an opportunity to see them and potentially purchase them before they're marketed to investors and the public, which, you know, as we know right now, the competition for inventory is really at an all-time frenzy. In addition to providing this first look opportunity, NCST has an experienced community development staff located in multiple geographical areas to provide technical assistance. And over the last 12 years, more than 1,000 community partners have used REO Match to put 27,000 properties back to productive use. But as you know, as large as that number sounds, we know it's only a drop in the bucket. So over the past several years, NCST has actually begun to, try to work at the policy level as well to make the changes that need to be made to support the type of work our community partners do. So we have a highly respected team of analysts and advocates who write research papers and develop policy proposals related to neighborhood stabilization, blight prevention, affordable homeownership, and racial equity in our nation's housing markets. We root our policy work in our knowledge of local real estate markets where we are transacting on a daily basis, as well as that relationship with local practitioners. And recently, we launched a new coalition called the Homeownership Alliance, which brings together some single-family practitioners who are working to produce affordable homeownership at scale, particularly in communities of color. We also manage the coalition supporting the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, a new legislative idea to create a tax credit that would support increasing the supply of homes for homeownership in weaker housing markets. And last but not least, in partnership with NeighborWorks America, we sponsor something called the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative, which focuses attention on the needs of those areas that may be on the precipice of decline, but where an ounce of prevention can be worth a pound of cure. We also support the creation of capital funds that provide mission-focused developers, many of which are minority-owned small businesses, with the well-priced loans that they need to conduct neighborhood-positive acquisition and rehab work. So for all of those reasons, I am so delighted to be on this panel. And in particular, I'm excited to introduce our first panelist here today. I came to this panel for a lot of reasons, but one of them was because I'm an Andre Perry fangirl and I wanted to be on the same panel with him. I know how for years I have been out there saying to people, we do this work in these markets, particularly in neighborhoods of color, and we see that a house that looks identical to a house somewhere else is priced differently. And why isn't anybody doing anything about this or paying attention to it? And Andre bursts onto the scene, and now this incredibly important issue is finally getting the attention that I think it deserves. So I'm going to stop talking and kick it over to Andre. If you could please just provide for us a brief overview of your research and describe some of your most important findings.
Yes, well, Julia, I wanted to thank you. It's always a pleasure to have as many fans that are outside of your mother as possible. And so I wanted to thank you for that wonderful introduction. But I actually think I'm going to introduce myself through my slides and my work. And so if you can just bear with me, I'm going to share my screen and let's see, slideshow, play from start and maximize it. Hopefully you can see my screen well. Julia, give me the thumbs up if you do. And it advanced to the next slide. Did it advance? Give me a thumbs up if okay.
It advanced and then it went back.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, I just wanted to check. So worthy of investment, the valuation of assets in Black communities. And a lot of this information I'm going to share with you can be found in my new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. It's actually not new. It's actually a year old as of yesterday. So happy birthday to Know Your Price. I'm at the Brookings Institution where I study Black majority neighborhoods and cities. and there's too many Black neighborhoods to put on a map, but here are the Black majority cities where the share of the Black population is 50% or higher. You can see there's a lot of them, more than 1,200 across the United States. And then, but like all good stories, I wanted to share, started at home. This is my house. This is where I grew up. This is 1320 Hill Avenue, Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. Wilkinsburg is a small Black majority municipality surrounded by Pittsburgh on three sides. And you can see here, the home is abandoned, it's boarded up. It's essentially worth the amount of back taxes. You can, if you agree to pay taxes through a recovery program through Allegheny County, you could own this home. But the home is worth so much more to me. As the story was told to me, that woman in the upper right-hand corner, her name is Elsie Boyd. I call her Mom. Mom made a deal with my maternal grandmother to take me in when I was born, and that's what she did. At the time, my mother was poor. She already had a child at 15, had me when she was 17. Then she was probably abused. And so Mom did what a lot of Black women did when there was some kind of economic shock to the community. She took in kids. She reared a bunch of them, Black kids, white kids. She reared about 12 to 15 for varying durations. Some would stay a few weeks, some would stay a few months. I would stay till I graduated from high school. One of the reasons why is my father, who's pictured here, he was a heroin addict. He was abusive. He was in and out of prison. He was eventually murdered in Jackson State Penitentiary right outside of Detroit. But I was told a narrative that he made bad choices. And so what I wanted to do, how I started on this journey, I started investigating the conditions of his choices, the surrounding environment. And so much starts with real estate and property. And I'm going to save you a history lesson, but both Mom and my father, Floyd, lived in areas that were redlined. We know the history of the Homeowners Loan Corporation drawing red lines, warranted that, or stated that Black neighborhoods, predominantly Black neighborhoods, were too hazardous to invest in low interest refinancing and down payment assistance. They were both displaced by highway construction through Black neighborhoods. They were in areas where there was urban renewal that bulldozed properties but never refurbished them. They also were was surrounded by predatory lenders, and in particular, those had rent-to-own schemes all over their neighborhoods. And then they were surrounded by restrictive racial housing covenants, so they could not leave these areas. But I started looking at home prices in Black neighborhoods. And on this chart, you see on the x-axis, that's the percentage of Black people in a zip code. On the y-axis, that's as indicated by the prices on top. That's the average list price by Zillow and census, using census data. So as you can see, homes in neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is less than 1%, home prices there on average are listed at $340,000 approximately. And they're about half as much in areas where the Black population is 50% or higher. But a lot of people say that's because of education, that's because of crime, that's because of other issues that blame Black people. But those are things you can control in a study. And that's what we did. We looked at the absolute price. We controlled for structural characteristics. So we wanted to get the homes with similar size, same number of rooms, square footage, so we can get an apples to apples comparison in that regard. But then we control for neighborhood amenities, things like education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics, because we wanted to see, get an apples to apples comparison between a home in a Black neighborhood and a similar home in similar social circumstances. So if there was if there was equity and parity, they should be the exact same price. But what we found pretty much astounds that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Cumulatively, there's 156 billion in lost equity across the United States. Wherever you see a magenta circle, that's where the valuation is occurring. Wherever you see a green circle, that's where homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher. And as you can tell, there's much more magenta than green, a lot more. Just to give you an example, in Philly, the Philly metro, homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by about 28%, about $36,000 per home. And it ranges wildly from metro to metro. Lynchburg, Virginia, 81% difference. Meaning if you helicopter a home in a Black neighborhood and place it in a white one of similar circumstances, social circumstances, it would increase in value by 81%. Rochester, negative 65. Jacksonville, negative 47. There are places where homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher. Nashville, plus 10. And Wichita Falls, plus 16. Boston, Massachusetts, plus 23%. And I always say, hey, Boston's no less racist than Lynchburg, but the home prices are higher. But I always put this into perspective so folks can get a sense of what's going on. 156 billion, what does that mean? 156 billion would have financed more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based on the average amount Black people use to start up their firms. Would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees based on the average amount of a four-year public education. Replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over, covered nearly all of Hurricane Katrina damage, and it's double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. Now, the reason why I put that last bullet there, I hope you can see the connection, is that my father was a heroin addict. If he lived in an area with home values were priced normally, he would have better schools, better infrastructure, better opportunities, start a business, go to college. His life, my family's life would have been different. This is why I say there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. We're constantly blaming Black people when things go wrong in neighborhoods and not looking for structural racism. I'm going to close with this a few quick slides. I want to rewind the clock to about 2 years ago when this report started to get traction, when we presented to Congress, and this is Representative Al Green of Texas. And he asked us a basic question of me and members of the appraisal industry. Is there discrimination in appraisals? Take a look at this.
If you think Black people are being discriminated when their property is being appraised, would you kindly raise your hand? One person on the panel. If you think that, for fear that I'm not communicating well, if you think that Black people are not being discriminated against when their property is being appraised, if you think they're not being discriminated against, kindly raise your hand. Okay, hands now, we're getting some consternation, I see.
And I presented that because now we see there's a racial reckoning around values all over the country, not only in appraisals, but tax assessments and in other forms of discrimination. All it takes is an organized group of people to take a stand. Certainly the data helped, but without all of your work on the ground, this would have never happened, this racial reckoning. So I'm looking forward to discussing solutions to this, but I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you to LISC and all the other folks who are making my work get the kind of traction and visibility our communities deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was terrific and a great introduction, a great kickoff to this conversation. I think we want to turn next to Denise Scott. And Denise, we'd like you to describe Project 10X preserving homeownership and and how preserving ownership seeks to address the issues around housing values and related issues.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. And I'm really pleased to be here. And Andre, thank you for the work that you're doing. It's much appreciated. Without your work, we really wouldn't be able to make the case as well. Project 10X is LISC's 10-year commitment to invest in and scale solutions to close the racial wealth gap everywhere we work. Project 10X frames LISC's philosophy around the work we've been doing for more than 40 years. One component of Project 10X is preserving homeownership, especially for families of color, in order to build equity and generational wealth. We know that homeownership is one of the biggest drivers of wealth building in this country, as you've just heard. By preserving and promoting homeownership, LISC will help long-time neighborhood residents, frequently people of color, benefit from their homes, the increased value in their homes, stabilize neighborhoods, and help families to build wealth. We can accomplish this critical mission by utilizing both financial and policy tools to preserve and create opportunities to increase the supply. Let me give you a brief overview of one of our most successful programs to preserve homeownership, the Detroit Zero Interest Home Repair Loan Program. LISC launched this program in 2015, and to date, we have repaired over 550 homes. Loans were around $20,000 on average, and the repairs focus on health and safety first, as well as other kinds of repairs, including lead removal. The program was conceived in Detroit at the time that the city was in crisis, and the mayor was worried about further abandonment. The city asked LISC to develop a program to repair homes and preserve the integrity of home ownership. We partnered with the city to leverage their federal dollars, along with privately raised funds from Bank of America and others. As we started engaging with homeowners, our eyes opened wide with the issues. For example, someone had been left a house but didn't have the title. Others owned the house, but someone else owned the land. The work to clear the titles was very complex, and we had to deal with these title issues before we could repair the roof or put in a new boiler. Other issues were encountered were municipal liens like water and sewer and real estate taxes. In response, we permitted people to use the LISC loan to pay off these liens, and we helped them unpack the issues around the title. But I think the biggest impact of the program was that it really helped to, as it increased the value of the individual homes with those loans, we started increasing the value across the market at a time when the market in Detroit was stalled. Before this, you could not get a mortgage in Detroit no matter what your income, and you certainly couldn't get a mortgage if you were folks at the lowest income level. Housing values went up, as I said, and the market values went up. This helped people who might have otherwise walked away stay in their homes. In addition to home repair, because that's a part of the work, but not the total work, we also help to build the credit and debt counseling support that families needed. And we also built the capacity of local developers, many of them developers of color, to play a part in the scale of the work of repair. It was important that we could have BIPOC contractors, for example, and engineers and construction managers participate with us. And so we provided a pathway for that. This program showed us how unique LISC is, that we've just started with the idea that we should help repair these homes because they needed repair, and we were concerned about abandonment along with the city. But as we looked into all of the layers of devaluation and the other complexities that stood in the way of putting a home repair loan on the property, we realized that all of the other parts of the work were necessary. So through this work, we're certain that if we could replicate this work throughout the country with additional funding support, we could make a tremendous difference. Over 500 homes in Detroit, this work could be done in every other part of the country. Right now in Memphis, we have adapted the program to the market because it's important that you adapt to the specifics of the market. And we expect to launch a similar program in Memphis in July. There, we expect to be able to improve about 200 homes. We know there's a need for this type of work and that we know what the impact of this work can be. So I just want everybody to understand that if we're preserving neighborhoods, we're building generational wealth. And at this point, we're certain that this innovation works. If we can scale it with additional resources, we can have tremendous impact. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Denise. And, we've really benefited from LISC's partnership when it comes to supporting the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which is going to be a tool to help scale, similar types of work that will be focused enough in neighborhoods and concentrated enough to really raise the values of everything in the neighborhoods, which is so important. And so turning now to more of that local flavor, let's turn to Pedro so that, Pedro, can you tell us how your approach to this work in Jacksonville has really changed since you've started to focus on building equity and wealth through housing?
And thank you, Julia. Again, thank you, Julia, for having me here today as part of this process. I really want to start with really giving you an overview of what Jacksonville really is as it relates to this issue. Jacksonville currently ranks 3rd in the U.S. for devaluation of Black neighborhoods, and also 8% of the homes in Black neighborhoods are heirs property. So the things that you've heard Andre talk about earlier, the things that you've heard Denise talk about earlier, these are really applicable here in the Jacksonville market. Next slide, please. What I put together on the next slide kind of gives you sort of an overview of that magenta that Andre talked about earlier. And ironically enough, since 1981, the majority white neighborhoods have gained two times the value of redline majority Black neighborhoods. And as you can see, that's a really large area here in the city. Again, making that magenta that Andre talked about really come alive. One thing that I asked that you keep in mind is that in 1967, Jacksonville actually consolidated its city of government. And so you have just one city government here in Jacksonville, but this idea of being redlined and the implications that has for actual neighborhoods plays out today. Next slide, please. Denise talked about this, and so I won't really spend a whole lot of time going through the model, but what we've done is really looked at the work here in Jacksonville from a systems approach, trying to figure out not only is this work important to LISC, but also bringing in partners inside of this process of making the change in these neighborhoods. And so our partnerships look like not only does it include LISC, but it includes the Community Foundation, it includes the Three Rivers Legal Service, and it also includes the University of Florida. Next slide, please. And so we looked at this thing not only from a macro level, and that macro level really being with the University of Florida and how we address the algorithm that goes into the devaluation of homes, but we've also looked at it in the micro level in terms of how do we address the issues associated with heirs property? How do we also do this very same issue as it relates to back property taxes? So when you put all of those things together, we really get a chance to move the needle on Black wealth. Again, what does it look like in a macro environment, and what does it actually look like in a micro environment? And that is addressing the issues of heirs property. And if you live in Florida, you understand that that's particularly important, particularly when hurricanes hit our city and you don't have access to federal relief funds to actually repair your homes. We've kind of broken this thing down into 3 areas. preservation of properties, the protection of properties, and the production of properties. So really looking at how do we drive the scale of creating Black wealth in these neighborhoods by not disenfranchising people who live in those communities, but how do we keep them in place and also make sure that that property remains in the family so that they can create generational wealth. Next slide, please. So our expected outcomes, as you can see here, is to empower homeowners to use their homes for family wealth creation by addressing the heirs property issue, by cleaning up titles as they were doing in Detroit, as we plan on doing in Memphis, so that those families have a way of passing down those houses from generation to generation to generation, eradicating heirs property and cleaning up the titles, maximizing the use of property tax exemptions. You will not believe how many people in these communities don't have access to tax exemptions that were put in place for them to maintain their property, and increase the number of safe, sanitary, and secure homes. And we do that through our home protection preservation program by making sure that, you know, I use, and just a random name, Ms. Johnson, has a house that's reflective of her being a staple in that neighborhood. So we've been very conscious of our home repair program. She needs a new roof. We work with her to get a new roof on her house, and increase the assessed and appraised values of Black home assets for generations to come. Last slide. And so for us, it's each $100,000 invested in these community interventions, legal, financial counseling services. Again, it preserves $1 million in assessed value, a 10-to-1 ratio in terms of return on investment. So Julia, that's kind of how we looked at our approach to really changing the context and complexity of the market in terms of BIPOC communities here in Jacksonville.
Thank you so much for that presentation. You know, it sounds like a very comprehensive approach, and, you know, along with some of the appraisal issues that Andre has brought out, the heirs property issues, I think, are starting to get a lot of attention right now. And in thinking about some of the themes throughout all of these conversations, so we've heard some, you know, we've heard some data, we've heard some specific programmatic initiatives, but let's go to sort of my favorite topic. I like to talk about policy. And so I'm curious, you know, if each or any of you can talk to either federal or state and local policies that you think need to be changed to make your jobs easier and the work you're trying to do more effective and scalable.
Well, I'll go first while Andre gets his. I talked earlier about us approaching it from a macro and a macro perspective. That's why we brought in the University of Florida in terms of helping us address the algorithm associated with property devaluation. So if we can get that particular piece changed from a local perspective, we have the data, we have an accredited university in the area who's helped us move that forward. You know, one thing that we've come to understand is that data doesn't lie, and data has the capacity to speak for itself. So we've taken that approach, but we also understood that we needed to do something in the immediacy to help people with some relief. So that's why we've addressed the issue of back property taxes and heirs property in our particular area.
So,
go ahead. Sorry.
do you want me to go?
Yeah, go
So there's a number of policy solutions that we're considering. I mean, first of all, passing a foreclosure protection law that allows for flexibility with mortgage payments, such as extending the mortgage an additional year or two. Imagine what that would have done back in 2008. Or providing funds for down payment assistance and homebuyer education, much more than what's available now. Freezing property taxes in hot markets and increasing the access to grants and zero interest loans for home repair. Hopefully that's something that LISC will be able to do to scale up the resources. Developing alternative housing, and this gets into some places zoning, and some places it's the politics of density. But the idea that community land trusts and land banks and accessory dwelling units may be a way to get at density in such a way to preserve affordability and increase the supply. And then you mentioned this, Julia, the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act that would provide tax credits to support developing and rehabbing single-family homes in distressed communities. And the last point I'll make, how about if we start paying people a living wage? Because this is not all about just the housing per se, but the idea that, like in New Jersey, where they piloted, or they just started to pilot a universal basic income, this idea that in addition to the issues around homeownership, wage is a major issue that is creating some of the disparities.
Andre, did you have some more things to add?
Yeah, oh man, those are all great comments, and one of the reasons why I really need to work more closely with LISC is because many of these initiatives are actually very viable. They can actually accelerate wealth creation, home ownership, higher value, and they're actually working. They just need to get at a scale or fund it so they can get to a scale where they have a bigger impact. That's why I'm actually encouraged by a recent bill that was introduced by Representatives Cleaver and Torres. They introduced the Real Estate Valuation Fairness and Improvement Act of 2021, and it's going to create an interagency task force that looks at the disparities in valuation, and they taken a lot of our research and informing this, and so I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to share about these on the ground solutions. In addition, there's the equity scoring bill that was recently passed. Now, why this is important, the CBO has proposed, or the Congress has proposed, scoring every policy that comes through. The same way we judge a policy on its impact on the budget, they're going to judge a policy based on its impact on Black and brown people and communities. And so no longer can we have these policies come through without doing an analysis on how it's going to impact the people who need it most. And then finally, I just want to say I'm involved in a bunch of state level policies that are creating funds to make up for this gap between the cost of building and how these places are appraised. So a number of states have introduced. Maryland is the latest to pass a piece of legislation to do this, but a number of local initiatives are really taking shape in which states are now backing with resources. So, but I just want to say what we're hearing from Denise and Irvin, these are like real solutions that we just need to bolster with increased funds. And I can't say this enough, it must come from the federal level to really scale up. It's going to have to be federal, but we need to keep pushing these initiatives so when the time comes to elevate them at the national level, they're not trying to create things, they're adopting models that are already in use.
Yeah, I mean, I see a few more questions coming through in the Q&A, but I'm just going to take the moderator prerogative to say something about when you do get federal resources. And this partly goes to Denise's point about income and wages. You know, if something like the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act passes, that's going to be an enormous federal investment that is targeted specifically for home ownership. You know, we use other federal programs for home ownership. We might use home or CDBG funding, but you're always kind of fitting a square peg into a round hole. And, you know, at the end of the day, those aren't supporting that much work on the home ownership side and on the home repair side. But if we get a new big resource like this, one question I have and want to put out there to everybody listening is, how do we make sure that the communities we're trying to help benefit from the whole thing? How do we make sure that those developers in those communities and developers of color are getting in on it, so to speak? How do we make sure that the good construction wages that would come from these projects are in that community, and are at the same time as we're building that stock, that much needed stock for home ownership, can we at the same time be building these small businesses, so that they can begin to grow and take advantage of opportunities that you only have when you're a more experienced business that has done more work. So I just want to encourage everybody, sometimes it's hard when you're trying to pass any of these legislative efforts. You're trying so hard to pass it. You're not preparing for what happens if you win. And so, I want to put that out there. I'm going to pull a few, there's a number of things in the Q&A. I'm going to try to pull from them to, build on what we've already talk about. And there's one I want to pull out here just because no conversation about anything related to this topic can occur without the G word, which is gentrification. And let's talk about what it, how we work to increase housing values, but how do we prevent the types of displacement we've seen when values start going up?
Well, Denise had it, I mean, to really encapsulate this. When people are owners, they're benefiting from increased value. What's problematic is that home ownership is so low, business ownership is so low, that when you develop a place, property values increase and it pushes people out. And so we need a number of initiatives to create owners, and not just homeowners. I just want to be clear about that. It's business owners as well. And so when we're restoring commercial corridors, when we are creating new communities, we should be using zoning policy to protect, to ensure that low income renters can be converted to homeowners. We talk about the lack of inventory, but remember, in lots of cities, there's thousands of properties priced below a price point that a mortgage or a bank won't back with a mortgage. And so those are the kind of areas you want to zone for, to use your community development block grant money to create programs that will convert low income renters to owners. But no one complains about gentrification when you have a high percentage of people from the community who are owners, because then they benefit. So the trick is we need to create owners in these communities.
Yeah, I think that's really, that's an excellent point. I want to pull together two questions out there that I think are really related. Catherine has asked, in those neighborhoods that you found where Black homes were valued, or homes in Black areas were valued higher, what makes the difference? And then Dominique asked, are there examples where communities have succeeded in changing the dynamics? Now, I'm not sure the places you found where those valuations were higher are necessarily where the community itself set out to change the dynamics.
Right.
Let's toss that over to you.
But I like the question, because there are some places that have the necessary ingredients for increased values, or values that are market rate. And it generally goes to, again, not to repeat everything that Denise and Irvin has said, but it is true. Those places where there are green is more likely you have higher home ownership, more likely you have anchor institutions that employ Black people in the area that provides decent wages. So if you look at Nashville, it's Meharry, it's Fisk, it's other, and now this is each area has a story. In Nashville, the homeowners are older. And so what and this goes back to Urban's work, what I like am very scared if there's not a plan to pass those homes down. And I could care less if you buy, sell, whatever. But if you're not going to maximize the value, that's the problem. And so for me, when you have a situation where you have all these ingredients, you have anchor institutions that employ people, you have people with benefits, you have good housing stock, good ownership. We can replicate those ingredients in other places, and we just have to be deliberate about it. Because when that happens, you see generally stable communities, and right now there's only a few places where that naturally occurs. Most of them are smaller municipalities. So if you say like a Grambling, Louisiana, only 5,000 people, but it has a university nearby, it has decent home ownership. People are still in poverty, but you don't see the kind of devaluation you see in other areas.
And I think one other point that Andre brought up that can't be overlooked is the commonality between all of those communities is they have a very strong HBCU as the anchor institution. So if you think about Grambling, if you think about Meharry, if you think about all of those areas, they have strong HBCUs that are serving as anchor institutions. But I think even bigger than that, we have to talk about how do we value our things in those very same community. And that starts with the level of financial literacy about things that we own in those communities.
And there are a number of cities, Julia, who have begun to think quite progressively on this front. And they're really looking at the fact that while their cities may be gentrifying, Charlotte comes to mind, that there are strategies that need to be considered where money is leveraged in such a way that we're preserving everything that was built to be affordable. Let's preserve that. And then let's build with ownership and with long-term tenure in mind. And that's also create opportunities for people, not only in neighborhoods that are concentrated with the lowest income, but also to create opportunities for people in growing neighborhoods of opportunity. So there are a number of strategies. I think the private sector coming together with government and community around understanding that if we don't tackle this issue, what has happened in the past has to change. We need systemic change around the issue. I think that we're starting to see this unfold in a number of places. I think if we're talking, our hope is 10 years from now, we'll be able, we hope, to paint a different story with some of the new and innovative strategies that we're considering.
And Denise and I can't say this enough, that we do need new forms of ownership. In some areas of the country, it's, to own a home is not impossible, but it's a lot harder to buy a home in the Oakland area than it is in Detroit. And so in some parts of the country, we do need cooperative or new forms of ownership, period. And, and that's just going to take a lot more innovation at the policy and at the market level.
Right. And some of it is thinking, in addition to thinking about really, specific structures such as community land trusts, I've noticed some of it is thinking beyond the single family 1-unit house, thinking about multi-unit houses, thinking about condos and co-ops, thinking about manufactured housing, all of these things, in addition to the products and the way we're structuring the ownership, we have to be just very broad in the way we think about being able to give people those entryways, those first steps on the ladder. We could talk about this for a long time. There's one question out there that I really want to get to, though, especially given who many of the people in the audience are today, which is, how is philanthropy, or as it's put in the Q&A, how is mega philanthropy playing a role in solutions to these issues?
Well, I'll be the first to start on that question because, again, philanthropy afforded us the opportunity to step outside the box to be able to address these issues. I think mega philanthropy has the capacity to offer that level of leeway as it relates to addressing many of the issues that we are discussing on this call today. So they have the runway, they have the resources to say, try this, or at least be amenable to trying something different and out of the box solutions.
Yeah, and well, go ahead, Denise. Go ahead, Denise.
I was just only going to just add to what Irving said. It really is the runway to bringing together flexible long-term capital that we can use to innovate. And the fact is that while the government, as Andre said, the federal government is perhaps the biggest partner in this solution, even that needs to be leveraged, we think, with the private sector. And because as you fund at the federal level, by the time you get down to the very local level, the resources are not, $2 billion at the state level is a lot less in any little city in any state. And there, the leverage factor matters a lot. So philanthropy can play a significant role in bringing to the table the type of resources that plays well with government resources.
I'm going to say something this very plain and obvious, but philanthropy needs to fund people who actually care about Black communities. I see a lot of folks who are funded in this space that have really no interest in developing Black people. They might have interest in developing brick and mortar around Black people, but they don't have really interest in Black people. Now, I will say that, and similar to what Denise and Irvin has described, I've seen philanthropy almost stand in as a bank in terms of providing new types of mortgages or loans or grants, as well as creating new credit scoring systems and the like. And so I actually think we should continue that kind of behavior at a demonstration level to show what can be done in neighborhoods. I also think that philanthropy, and this is going to be very selfish of me, we should be pairing researchers with community development folks so that we can not only develop projects, but display the impact in terms of the numbers and have people like myself work with LISC affiliates and organizations to really maximize these opportunities, because we know that the story we tell at the national level, if we can share these success stories with data, with narrative, that we can actually get the kind of change that we're seeing now. And so that's my pitch to the funders out there. Make sure that you give me an opportunity to work with Irvin and Denise and other folks, because they have great initiatives that we need to elevate at the national level. And
Yeah,
Julia.
I mean, I'll just expand on a couple of things. Obviously there are two types of products that philanthropy can provide that are synergistic. One is grant funding, and especially, I think Denise mentioned this, it's really important to find the organizations that are doing the really good work and give them some running room and some flexibility to get going. No one who's ever worked at a nonprofit will not say that. It's so important. It is also important, as we see the model of philanthropy come to include more investment, PRI type investments, that those investments and grants work hand in hand so you can get sort of the maximum advantage out of all of them. I will note that, years ago, I had more grant funding for homeownership per se, and then there was some, a little bit of homeownership fatigue out there. And this issue has come back around with the focus on racial equity and realizing what an incredibly, not only does home ownership play an incredibly large role when it comes to the racial wealth gap, but the effects of redlining, which were around, specifically around home ownership, have left an imprint on every single aspect of our communities, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's public safety, everything tracks those old redlining maps. And so regardless of what the focus is of any particular philanthropy, investing in trying to root out the racialization of where we live and the segregation and the differentials in the home values is going to see benefits in all of those other areas as well. So, that I hope that gives folks some things to think about. We only have a few more minutes. We do have more questions out here, and of course, I will speak on behalf of the panel and say everybody is happy to answer your questions after the panel as well, and our contact information should be included somewhere. But I'll sort of wind up here with a question for Denise, which is, in addition to the preserving homeownership efforts, are there other programs that Project 10X is supporting?
Yes. So thank you, Julia, and I too am grateful for the opportunity to have this discussion. So we've highlighted within the discussion, I believe, that homeownership is a very key, important component of 10X, but that we also have to look at the economic development side, which is what 10X also does, to consider small business opportunities and helping to build equity across a variety of different innovative strategies. So we're leaning in. We're looking at the ways in which flexible capital policy, our community partners, the alignment with government, with philanthropy and other funders, we're leaning into all of the various ways that these solutions can really help. Our goal is to raise and invest $1 billion over the next 10 years to help close the racial wealth gap. We're hoping that $100 million in critical grant funding will be available to us and around $900 million in low debt and equity. We've started to raise the money. We've raised about $400 million, the vast majority, which will support the Black Economic Development Fund you'll hear more about soon, and loan guarantees for low-income tax credit developers, many of them who are BIPOC developers. Today, we're really excited about the opportunity to talk more about Project 10X, about homeownership and small business and equity, and how we really can close the racial wealth gap. I think it's important for everybody to understand that every dollar that LISC raises, we leverage. We leverage with other philanthropic dollars, with government dollars, and we leverage ideas to turn these ideas into significant and concrete solutions to take it to scale. And that's a really, really important part of the work. So what I would say to our philanthropic partners who have joined us today, first of all, we're really grateful, not only for the support that you have given LISC over the years, but for your joining us today to think with us on the ways that we can create a more just and equitable society. We're hoping that you will join us in a super intentional way to think about innovations that will help to close the wealth gap in terms of how you provide funding to support the kind of work that we're talking about here at LISC and across other partners across the country. So we really are looking for partners who will help us not only be intentional, but to be big and bold. And so let's invest at that kind of level. $1 billion over 10 years is a great start. And so we're really hoping to be able to lean into that. So again, thank you all. I want to thank my colleagues on the panel, Andre, for sharing your research. And by the way, I should mention the research is really important because it's really helping us to state the case, to prove the point, to test the theory of change. And so we're grateful to you for that. And Julia, as always, NCST has been a strong partner with LISC, and we continue to look forward for the ways that we can work together as we go forward. And Irving, well, what can I say? Jacksonville won't be the same under your leadership. So we're looking forward to all that you're going to do as you go forward. So thank you all for joining us today. And we're happy to follow up as this conversation ends. Thank you.